For millennia, ancient Egypt has stood as a symbol of grandeur and mystique, a civilization celebrated for its towering pyramids, majestic pharaohs, and rich mythology. We are often drawn to visions of illuminated temples and sacred rituals, picturing a society bathed in wisdom and divine order. Yet, this radiant image is only a surface illusion, a carefully constructed narrative that masks a far darker reality beneath. Beneath the golden sheen of Egyptian history lies a shadowed world where terror was a daily instrument, wielded especially against women. The terrifying punishments inflicted upon them reveal a harsh, violent mechanism of control, an aspect so brutal that it was deliberately buried by time and forgotten by many historians. Women were not only vulnerable to the whims of patriarchal authority, but were often the primary targets of laws and punishments designed to enforce male dominance through fear and humiliation. This documentary invites you to step beyond the sanitized tales of ancient Egypt and enter its hidden underworld, where justice was a weapon, punishment a spectacle, and women bore the brutal cost of maintaining a rigid social order. Here, beneath the myths and monuments, lies a history of suffering that history itself sought to erase. As we peel back the layers of time, we confront a truth long ignored, that the splendor of Egypt's civilization was built on the backs of women who endured unspeakable cruelty. Their stories are dark, painful, and urgent, because they force us to rethink everything we think we know about one of history's most revered cultures. Ancient Egypt's legal system is often celebrated for its complexity and the ideal of ma'at, balance, truth, and cosmic order. Yet beneath the celebrated veneer of justice lay a deeply unequal system, especially when it came to women. Far from receiving impartial treatment, women were systematically targeted by laws designed to enforce male control and uphold a patriarchal social order. These laws did not merely regulate conduct, but weaponized the justice system to punish women harshly for a wide range of behaviors, many linked to morality, obedience, and sexuality. Legal documents, such as the Papyrus Anastasi and the Murder Papyrus, along with inscriptions from court proceedings, reveal the disparities. Women accused of crimes like theft, slander, or adultery faced severe repercussions, often more brutal than those faced by men committing similar offenses. The court records show women dragged before magistrates, sometimes shackled and humiliated, their voices dismissed or overridden by male witnesses and officials. Their testimony was considered suspect. A woman's word could be twisted or discounted, leaving her vulnerable to the full force of the law. Gendered nature of Egyptian law was not incidental, it was deliberate. Women were legally regarded as dependents, often under the guardianship of husbands, fathers, or brothers. Their social standing hinged on their compliance with male authority. This meant that offenses like disobedience or insubordination were treated not as personal matters, but as threats to the entire family's honor and social fabric. Punishments could be harsh and public, serving as both correction and warning to other women. The legal focus on female morality extended beyond criminal acts to regulate sexuality and family dynamics. Women's fidelity was not only a matter of personal virtue, but of political and economic consequence, tied to property rights, inheritance, and the legitimacy of heirs. The law thus became a tool to control women. Women's bodies and behavior, ensuring they remained subservient to patriarchal structures. In one surviving court case from the New Kingdom period, a woman accused of adultery was subjected to interrogation that included physical threats and public shaming. The penalties prescribed, whipping, fines, and imprisonment, were meant to crush both body and spirit. The fear of such punishments enforced a rigid code of conduct that limited women's autonomy in intimate and social spheres. Yet it was not only criminal law that targeted women. Civil disputes over dowries, inheritance, or custody also reflected the precarious legal position of women. Even in cases where women sought protection or justice, their claims were often undermined by societal bias. Male relatives frequently acted as legal proxies, limiting women's ability to represent themselves or defend their rights independently. This systemic legal discrimination reveals how ancient Egyptian justice was a mechanism of social control, wielded primarily to uphold male dominance. The law promised order but delivered oppression, entrenching a society where women were both the subjects and objects of harsh discipline. By examining these legal frameworks, we understand the foundation upon which the terrifying punishments of women were built. This section lays bare the grim reality that justice in ancient Egypt was far from blind. It was a gendered force that systematically punished women to maintain an unequal social order. In ancient Egypt, a woman's body was not her own. It existed as a site of control, shaped and policed by societal fears about sexuality, honor, and lineage. Among the most feared transgressions a woman could commit was sexual immorality, a broad term that encompassed adultery, infidelity, promiscuity, and other behaviors perceived as threats to family honor and social stability. The punishments for such offenses were terrifying in their severity and public nature, designed to mark the guilty woman forever. Adultery was considered a grave crime, especially when committed by wives. While men's infidelities were often overlooked or treated with leniency, women faced harsh consequences. Legal texts and literary accounts describe how accused adulteresses could be scourged publicly, stripped of their dignity as their naked bodies were whipped with leather thongs. This punishment was not only physical but psychological, a public spectacle meant to shame, humiliate, and isolate the woman. In some instances, punishments went beyond whipping to mutilation. Cutting off the nose or ears was a common penalty, permanently disfiguring the woman and marking her as morally corrupt and dishonorable. Such physical marks functioned as a lifelong stigma, ensuring the woman's fall from social grace was visible to all. The body became a canvas of punishment and control, enforcing societal norms through violence. But the threat of punishment extended further. Women accused of sexual misconduct could be imprisoned, forced into servitude, or exiled from their communities. The fear of these penalties created an atmosphere of constant surveillance where women's behavior was policed not only by the state, but also by family members and neighbors. The laws governing female sexuality were intertwined with religious beliefs. Purity and chastity were seen as essential for maintaining ma'at, cosmic harmony. Texts warned that female transgressions would bring divine wrath not only upon the woman but upon her entire household. This belief system legitimized harsh punishments as necessary to appease the gods and restore order. Women's bodies thus became battlegrounds on which spiritual, social, and political conflicts played out. This strict control over female sexuality also reflected broader anxieties about lineage and inheritance. Ensuring the legitimacy of heirs was paramount in a society where property, titles, and power passed through bloodlines. Female infidelity threatened these structures, making women targets for harsh legal and social punishment. Historical records show that accusations of immorality could be wielded as weapons within families or political factions. Charges of adultery or promiscuity sometimes masked struggles over wealth, influence, or revenge. Women accused in these disputes suffered the full weight of the law, regardless of the truth of the allegations. Yet beneath these harsh realities lay a paradox. Egyptian culture also celebrated powerful female figures, goddesses like Isis, revered for their wisdom and strength. But mortal women lived under the shadow of these ideals, their freedoms curtailed by laws and punishments that ensured they remained subordinate and controlled. The terror of sexual control in ancient Egypt reveals a society deeply fearful of female autonomy. Through brutal punishments, the state and society sought to contain and dominate women's bodies, preserving a fragile social order at the cost of individual suffering. In the shadowed courts and dusty streets of ancient Egypt, justice was often more brutal than benevolent, particularly when meted out to women. Beyond the written laws and formal verdicts lay a grim arsenal of physical tortures and public humiliations designed not merely to punish, but to terrorize. These punishments were calculated spectacles of power, instruments intended to break the spirit, erode dignity, and warn others against defiance. One of the most common and feared methods was whipping. Women accused of crimes, often sexual or moral transgressions, were stripped naked and bound to posts in public spaces. The lash of leather thongs or braided reeds tore flesh and flesh alike, as their bare skin became a target for merciless blows. This punishment combined physical agony with deep humiliation. The exposure of the punished woman's body to public gaze served to shatter her honor, a currency as valuable as life itself in Egyptian society. Alongside whipping, shackling was another tool of oppression. Archaeological excavations reveal small, confined cells often constructed from stone or mud bricks, designed to imprison offenders under harsh conditions. Chains and metal restraints, though rarer, were used to immobilize, ensuring total submission. These cells deprived women not only of freedom, but of light, warmth, and human contact, fostering despair and physical decline. Public exposure extended beyond the whipping post. Women guilty of moral offenses could be paraded through marketplaces or temples, sometimes naked or dressed in humiliating garments designed to mark them as sinners. These public processions invited scorn, insults, and sometimes violence from onlookers. The spectacle ensured that punishment extended beyond the legal sentence to social death, isolating the woman from community and kin. More extreme punishments included mutilation, cutting off noses, ears, or fingers, a fate dreaded for its permanence. These acts were meant not only to punish the individual, but to brand her for life, a living reminder of her disgrace. The loss of facial features, in particular, was a symbolic erasure of identity and beauty, transforming the woman into a cautionary tale. Historical records and funerary texts hint that mutilation was often reserved for women perceived as serious threats to social order, their punishment serving as a grim deterrent. The cruelty of these punishments is all the more jarring when contrasted with the reverence accorded to female deities in Egyptian religion. Goddesses such as Isis, Hathor, and Sekhmet embodied power, fertility, and protection, an idealized vision of womanhood that stood in stark opposition to the brutal reality for many mortal women. This dichotomy reveals a society that could simultaneously worship feminine strength in the divine while violently suppressing it in the living. These instruments of punishment were more than physical tools, they were weapons of psychological terror. The public nature of the torture ensured that fear permeated society, reinforcing strict social hierarchies and silencing dissent. The scars left on women's bodies were also scars on the collective conscience, hidden but indelible. In this brutal framework, women were subjected to relentless surveillance and control, punished harshly when stepping outside prescribed roles. The methods of torture and humiliation were part of a deliberate strategy to maintain order through fear, ensuring that the patriarchal grip remained unchallenged. While public punishments struck fear across communities, many of the most pervasive and personal acts of violence against women in ancient Egypt occurred behind closed doors in the home. The domestic sphere, far from a sanctuary, was a crucible of patriarchal control where husbands, fathers, and male guardians exercised significant authority over women, sanctioning punishments for perceived disobedience, negligence, or failure to uphold family honor. Ancient Egyptian society was fundamentally patriarchal, with men holding legal and social power over female relatives. Women were expected to obey male heads of household, manage domestic affairs, bear children, and maintain the family's reputation. Failure to meet these expectations could provoke harsh repercussions, often administered privately, but with deep psychological and physical consequences. Legal texts and household accounts reveal that male guardians had near-absolute control over women's behavior within the family. Husbands, in particular, could punish wives physically for disobedience or insubordination. While formal legal structures often ignored or minimized domestic violence, such acts were culturally sanctioned as necessary to maintain order. Women who challenged this authority risked escalating violence, not only from their husbands, but also from fathers or brothers tasked with preserving family honor. Physical punishment in the home could range from beatings with rods or hands to confinement in small, dark rooms. Though less visible than public lashings or mutilations, these domestic punishments were no less severe and often more sustained, contributing to cycles of fear and submission. The threat of violence was a constant reminder to women of their subordinate status and the limits of their autonomy. Moreover, domestic punishment extended beyond physical violence. Women faced emotional abuse, social isolation within their families, and the threat of being cast out or divorced, which in ancient Egypt could mean destitution or loss of children. The fear of these repercussions often silenced women, preventing them from seeking justice or support. The intersection of legal codes with cultural norms created a system that both permitted and obscured domestic punishment. While the state wielded public power to enforce social order, the family unit functioned as a microcosm where patriarchal authority was enacted without oversight. This blurred boundary made it difficult for women to escape or challenge their abusers. Family disputes over dowries, fidelity, or child-rearing frequently escalated into violent confrontations. Women accused of neglect or failure to produce male heirs were especially vulnerable to punishment. Such practices ensured that women's value was tied to their usefulness in the household and their obedience to male authority. This section exposes the intimate violence that permeated women's daily lives, punishments not administered by distant officials, but by the very men entrusted with their care. The home was a battleground where power, control, and fear collided, reinforcing a patriarchal order that demanded female submission through relentless discipline. By understanding the domestic dimension of punishment, we gain insight into the totalizing nature of gendered oppression in ancient Egypt. It was not only the laws or public spectacles, but the private, hidden acts of control that sustained a system designed to suppress women's autonomy and enforce their subjugation. Beyond the domestic walls and legal courts, women in ancient Egypt also found themselves ensnared in the ruthless games of political power and religious authority. When tensions ran high, social order was threatened, or rulers sought to consolidate power, women often became convenient scapegoats, accused of crimes they did not commit, persecuted as symbols of chaos, or punished for alleged conspiracies. Their suffering was not incidental. It was a deliberate tactic to reinforce male supremacy and silence potential threats. Ancient Egyptian religion was deeply intertwined with governance. Priests and rulers invoked divine order Ma'at to legitimize their authority and maintain societal stability. Women who were perceived as challenging this order, whether through independent religious roles, political affiliations, or dissent, were accused of disturbing the sacred balance. Charges of witchcraft, sorcery, or impiety were leveled against women to justify their punishment, often in terrifying and public ways. Historical records hint at cases where women accused of sorcery were tried and punished harshly, subjected to ritual humiliations, imprisonment, or even execution. Magic and the supernatural were double-edged swords in ancient Egypt, used both to protect and to persecute. Women's association with mystical knowledge or practices could be construed as dangerous rebellion, provoking fear and violence. Political intrigue also cast women as pawns and victims. Royal courts were arenas of conspiracy, and women connected to rival factions or dissenting nobles could be accused of treason or espionage. Such accusations carried the gravest penalties: execution, imprisonment, or exile, often carried out with brutal efficiency. These punishments served to eliminate rivals and send a clear message about the consequences of defying authority. Women caught in these purges suffered intensely. Their public trials were spectacles of humiliation designed to strip them of dignity and power. Executions might be carried out through strangulation, drowning, or other means, often accompanied by the destruction of property and erasure of their names from records, attempts to obliterate their existence entirely. These acts of persecution reveal a society deeply anxious about female influence and autonomy. The very idea of women as political or religious agents threatened the patriarchal order. By targeting women as scapegoats, rulers and priests deflected broader social tensions and reinforced male dominance. The fear of female power was not unique to ancient Egypt, but here it manifested through a systematic use of violence and spectacle. Women became embodiments of disorder, witches, conspirators, traitors, whose punishment was necessary to restore harmony. Their suffering served as a chilling reminder of the limits placed on women's freedom and agency. This section exposes the darkest intersections of gender, power, and fear. It shows how women's bodies and lives were manipulated to uphold a rigid hierarchy, revealing a pattern of oppression that transcended personal punishment to serve the political and religious machinery of control. Despite the widespread and systematic brutality inflicted upon women in ancient Egypt, these stories of suffering have been largely erased from the dominant historical narrative. The silence surrounding women's punishment is not an accident, but a product of cultural bias, patriarchal historiography, and the selective nature of archaeological preservation. Ancient Egyptian history has long been told through the lens of rulers, priests, and monumental achievements, narratives controlled by male elites who shaped the record to highlight power, divinity, and order. In this process, the voices of marginalized groups, especially women who suffered punishment and humiliation, were suppressed or ignored. The very instruments of their suffering, prisons, whipping posts, torture devices, were often considered unworthy of preservation or study. Moreover, the cultural stigma attached to punished women contributed to their erasure. A society that branded women as dishonored or immoral often saw no need to memorialize their pain. Inscriptions and texts that mentioned female transgressors were frequently destroyed or defaced to remove traces of shame from public memory. This act of erasure extended beyond ancient times, influencing modern historians who relied on limited sources filtered through male perspectives. Archaeology, too, has struggled to uncover the full extent of women's suffering. Sites associated with punishment, such as prisons or domestic spaces of violence, are less conspicuous than grand temples or royal tombs. Without explicit records or artifacts, the experiences of these women remain fragmented and obscured. Only through careful reinterpretation of legal documents, literature, and minor inscriptions can scholars piece together the shadowed history of female punishment. This silence is a form of ongoing violence. It denies recognition to the victims and obscures the mechanisms of patriarchal control that shaped ancient Egyptian society. By confronting these buried histories, we challenge the myth of a purely enlightened civilization and acknowledge the darker realities that sustained it. Recovering these stories demands a re-examination of sources and a willingness to listen for voices long muted. It forces a reckoning with the ways history is constructed, remembered, and forgotten. Most importantly, it restores humanity to the countless women who endured unimaginable horrors, whose suffering was erased, but whose legacy insists on being heard. Through this act of remembrance, we not only honor their resilience, but also illuminate the patterns of gendered violence that persist through time, urging vigilance against the erasure of marginalized voices in all histories. As the sun set over the ancient Nile, the echoes of a civilization's grandeur often drown out the anguished cries of its forgotten victims. The terrifying punishments women endured in ancient Egypt reveal a stark truth beneath the splendor. A society sustained by rigid patriarchy, where power was maintained through cruelty, fear, and relentless control. These punishments were not anomalies or isolated acts of brutality. They were systemic, woven into the very fabric of law, family, and religion. The journey through these hidden histories exposes how women's bodies became battlegrounds for societal fears and male dominance. From public torture to domestic violence, from legal discrimination to political scapegoating, the mechanisms of punishment were vast and terrifying. Yet, despite this suffering, these stories were silenced, erased by the weight of cultural bias and historical neglect. Unearthing these agonies forces us to confront uncomfortable realities, not only about ancient Egypt, but about the enduring legacies of gendered violence that echo into our present. It challenges the sanitized narratives we inherit and compels us to recognize the resilience of women who survived and resisted such oppression. To remember these women is to honor their humanity and to bear witness to the full scope of history, dark and painful as it may be. It is a call to refuse silence, to acknowledge suffering, and to learn from the past. Only by doing so can we hope to dismantle the structures of oppression that persist and ensure that history's forgotten victims are never again consigned to the shadows.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.